During an unusual morning, a rich man with a restless and suspicious appearance arrives near a river in his luxurious car. In the passenger seat, his 70-year-old mother, wheelchair-bound with white hair, feels immeasurable fear about what is about to happen. When he honks at the horse that was in his way, the animal senses something strange. When they reach the river, the man puts his mother inside the boat and, upon reaching the strongest part of the current, pushes the lady into the deep waters, watching as she sinks along with the wheelchair. The horse witnesses the cruel act and decides to act. What he does next leaves everyone deeply shocked. The golden morning sun gently caressed Madeleine's snow-white hair as she adjusted the small, yellowed envelope between her wrinkled fingers. At 70, her blue eyes still sparkled with the same vivacity as decades ago. Even if her legs no longer carried her along the paths she had loved to wander. Her wheelchair had become her constant companion in recent months, but it hadn't diminished the warm smile that always lit up her face when she saw her son. Robert carefully pushed the chair along the path leading to the Willow Creek River, his measured steps contrasting with the usual hurry he displayed in business. At 45, he had built a financial empire that was the envy of many. But this morning, he seemed different. His shoulders bore an invisible weight, and his hands trembled slightly on the cold metal of the chair's handles. "What a beautiful morning, isn't it, my son?" Madeleine took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp air rising from the mighty river. The scent of fresh water mingled harmoniously with the sweet aroma of wildflowers dotting the rural landscape. "It's been so long since we came here together." The soft sound of the current echoed through the tranquil morning, creating a natural symphony that always calmed the old woman's heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting memories carry her back to a time when Robert was just a curious boy, running along these very banks, chasing butterflies and collecting smooth stones to skip across the water. "Yes, Mom," Robert replied, his voice strained with a tension she couldn't identify. "We need to talk about some important things." Madeleine turned her head slightly to look at him, noticing for the first time the deep shadows under his eyes. When was the last time she had truly paid attention to how he was doing? The months in the wheelchair had made her so focused on her own limitations that perhaps she had missed the signs that her son was also struggling with something. "Are you all right, dear? You look worried," she asked, reaching out to touch his arm lightly. Her fingers felt the tension in his rigid muscles, as if he were bracing himself for something terrible. "I'm just thinking about the future." Robert averted his gaze, focusing on the path ahead. The lie burned in his throat, but he swallowed the discomfort. The envelope in her hands held his financial death warrant, documents she had kept for safekeeping, unaware that they now represented his only salvation. They reached a clearing where the river curved gently, forming a small wooden pier Robert had commissioned years ago. The spot was perfect, isolated, tranquil, far from prying eyes. A small but sturdy boat was tied to the pier, swaying softly with the current. "What a wonderful surprise!" Madeleine exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with genuine joy. "You brought the boat. It's been years since we've gone boating together." The pure happiness in her voice was like a stab to Robert's heart. For one terrible moment, he hesitated. How had he come to this point? How had the boy she raised with so much love and sacrifice transformed into the man who now contemplated the unthinkable? Federal investigations were closing in around him like a noose tightening around his neck. Debts grew exponentially each day, and his investors were starting to ask inconvenient questions. But it was the contents of that yellowed envelope that truly terrified him. Evidence of his early financial shenanigans that his mother had kept, thinking she was protecting her son for the future. "Come on, Mom." Robert forced a smile as he locked the wheelchair. "I'll help you into the boat. We have a lot to talk about." Madeleine held the envelope tighter, unaware that those yellowed papers sealed not only his fate, but hers as well. As Robert carefully lifted her from the chair, She whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for having such a thoughtful son. Neither of them noticed that, on the other side of the river, a white horse grazed peacefully on the bank, its ears perked, catching every sound from the water. The boat glided smoothly through the clear waters, pulling away from the pier with the rhythmic strokes of Robert's experienced hands on the oars. Madeline settled into the cushioned seat, holding the envelope firmly against her chest as she watched the familiar landscape slowly pass by. The green banks of the river held so many precious memories that her heart warmed with each turn. "Remember when you were 8 and fell into this very river?" Madeline chuckled softly, pointing to a stretch where some large rocks formed a small rapid. "You were so determined to catch that golden fish that you didn't even notice when you slipped off the rock." Robert forced a smile, but his hands tightened on the oars. Every memory she shared was like salt in an open wound. How could he be planning something so terrible against the woman who had saved him so many times, who had loved him unconditionally even when everyone else doubted him? "I remember." "Mom," his voice came out hoarser than he intended, "you jumped in with all your clothes on to pull me out, and then gave me the biggest lecture of my life," he added, trying to keep the conversation normal as he rowed towards the center of the river, where the current was stronger and deeper. Madeleine tilted her head, studying her son's face with that maternal intuition that never left her. There was something different in his eyes today, a shadow she couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps it was the stress of business. Robert had always been ambitious, even as a child. Sometimes she wondered if she herself hadn't planted that seed, always telling him he could conquer the world if he worked hard enough. "You know, dear," she said, stroking the envelope tenderly, "I've always kept some important things. Documents, papers. You never know when you might need them in the future." Robert's blood ran cold. She was talking about the envelope, about the documents that could destroy everything he had built. His first questionable contracts, the accounting manipulations that no one else knew existed. How had she gotten these papers, and why had she kept them for so long? "What kind of documents, Mom?" he asked, trying to sound casual as he observed the increasing depth of the water around them. "Oh, office things you used to leave scattered around when you still lived at home," she replied innocently. "I always thought they might be important, so I kept everything in a special box. A mother never knows when she needs to protect her son, does she?" The irony of the situation was devastating. She had kept exactly what he needed to eliminate, thinking she was protecting him. And now, unknowingly, she offered her own death sentence into his hands. On the other side of the river, the white horse lifted its head from the grass it was grazing, its nostrils flaring as if sensing something in the air. The animal took a few steps towards the water, its pointed ears following the movement of the boat, which was moving further and further from the safe bank. "Robert, you're rowing too fast," Madeline noticed, bracing herself better in the seat. "There's no hurry. I want to enjoy every minute of this outing with you." He slowed his pace, but continued to guide the boat towards the center of the river. His hands sweated on the oars, and he could hear his own heart pounding too loudly. It was now or never. The investigations wouldn't wait, the creditors wouldn't be patient, and that envelope represented the end of everything. "Mom," his voice trembled slightly, "I need to tell you something important." Madeline straightened, her blue eyes fixing on her son's face with full attention. There was such genuine concern in her gaze that Robert almost gave up on everything. Almost. But then he thought of prison, public shame, the loss of everything he had worked for. "You can tell me, my love. Your mother is here to listen." The white horse on the bank began to pace nervously, its faint whinnies echoing through the morning like a warning no one could understand. The words caught in Robert's throat, as if his own body rebelled against what his desperate mind planned. Madeline waited patiently, her blue eyes full of love and absolute trust in the son she had raised. The yellowed envelope remained in her hands, holding secrets she never imagined were dangerous. "Mom, do you remember what things were like when I started in business?" Robert finally broke the silence, his voice laden with bitter nostalgia. I was so young, so inexperienced. Yes, dear. I remember. Madeline smiled tenderly. You worked day and night, slept at the office more often than at home. I worried, always brought you food. I found papers scattered everywhere. She caressed the envelope again, not noticing how the gesture made Robert flinch. That's why I started keeping some documents. A mother always thinks about her son's future. You never know when something might be useful to prove his hard work. His dedication. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the wave of guilt that threatened to shatter his resolve. She had kept the evidence of his early crimes, thinking she was preserving proof of his diligence. Her genuine kindness made everything infinitely more painful. You've always been a wonderful mother, he whispered, and for the first time in years, his words were completely sincere. You always believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. Don't talk like that, Robert. Madeleine reached out her free hand to touch her son's face. You've always deserved my love. From the day you were born, you were my greatest joy, my reason for living. The words pierced Robert's heart like sharp knives. How could he be planning to destroy the only person who had truly loved him unconditionally? His eyes welled with tears that he quickly disguised, pretending it was just the sun's reflection on the water. Around the boat, the dark river water seemed to mirror the darkness that had consumed his soul. How had he reached this point? When exactly had the boy she loved transformed into this man capable of contemplating the unthinkable? I could never forget you, Mom. He stopped, swallowing the words that wanted to come out. You're the only person who truly loves me, was what he wanted to say. But admitting it would make what he was about to do even more monstrous. Madeleine noticed a low-hanging willow branch approaching, its green leaves softly touching the water's surface. It was exactly the kind of obstacle that always required careful navigation in that part of the river. She opened her mouth to warn Robert, but he had already seen it. "Watch out for the branch, son," she said softly, not realizing how Robert stiffened at her words. It was the perfect moment. The branch offered the ideal excuse, a sudden movement to avoid the obstacle, a loss of balance, a tragic accident no one would question. Robert gripped the oars tightly, preparing for the move that would change everything forever. On the distant bank, the white horse stopped abruptly, as if sensing that something terrible was about to happen. Its dark eyes fixed on the boat slowly heading towards the hanging branch. The animal began to tremble, its primitive instinct screaming warnings that only it could comprehend. "Robert, are you all right?" Madeleine asked, noticing how rigid her son had become. "You seem..." But her words were interrupted by Robert's sudden and violent movement. Pretending to try to avoid the branch, he abruptly rocked the boat sideways, creating an artificial wave that made Madeleine instantly lose her balance. "Robert!" she cried, her hands flailing in the air as she struggled to hold on to something. The yellowed envelope flew from her hands, hovering in the air for an eternal moment before beginning its descent towards the dark waters. Time seemed to slow for Robert. He saw the growing terror in his mother's eyes, heard her panicked cry echoing through the tranquil morning, watched the envelope with the compromising documents falling inexorably into the water. It was exactly what he had planned. But the reality was infinitely more brutal than his imagination. "Son, help me!" Madeleine pleaded, her hands desperately trying to cling to the side of the boat as her body dangerously tilted over the cold water. For one terrible and revealing moment, Robert simply watched. His hands remained inert on the oars, his face a mask of calculated coldness that his mother had never seen before. It was as if she were looking at a complete stranger, a man who shared the face of her beloved son, but whose soul had become something she couldn't recognize. "Robert, please," she cried again, but this time there was something different in her voice. It wasn't just physical fear. It was the growing horror of a mother realizing that the son she had loved unconditionally had transformed into something monstrous. The white horse on the bank let out a sharp, desperate whinny that echoed across the water like a lament. What happened next was too fast for Madeleine to fully process. Her body, already unbalanced by the boat's sudden movement, couldn't resist the second, calculated push Robert gave. This time, there was no more pretense. It was a deliberate and cold movement, executed with the precision of someone who had planned every detail. "Ah, Robert!" Madeleine's scream was lost in the air as she tumbled into the river's icy water, the thermal shock instantly robbing her breath. The wheelchair, which Robert had strategically positioned in the boat, fell with her, its metal weight rapidly dragging her down. The dark river water enveloped her like icy arms, and Madeleine felt absolute panic consume every fiber of her being. Her paralyzed legs didn't respond to her brain's desperate commands, and the weight of the wheelchair pulled her inexorably into the depths. She managed to surface once, swallowing a painful amount of water as she gasped for air and screamed for help. "Son, help me, please!" Her voice was hoarse and desperate, interrupted by involuntary gulps of the frigid water that invaded her mouth with each attempt to breathe. Robert remained in the boat, observing the scene with a coldness he himself didn't recognize. It was as if he were watching a movie, disconnected from the reality of what was happening. The woman struggling in the water didn't seem to be his mother. She was just an obstacle between him and his freedom. But then his eyes met hers. For one eternal moment, Madeleine stopped fighting the water and simply looked at her son. There were no more pleas in her blue eyes, only a devastating understanding and a sadness so profound that it pierced Robert's emotional armor like a sharp blade. "Why?" was all she managed to whisper before sinking again, the question carrying decades of betrayed love and shattered trust. That single word broke something fundamental within Robert. For one terrible instant, he saw himself through her eyes, a monster disguised as a son, a predator who had used the purest maternal love as bait for a deadly trap. His hands instinctively moved towards the oars, as if to help her, but then the reality of his situation hit him again. If he saved her now, everything would be lost. The investigations, prison, the destruction of everything he had worked for. The envelope had already sunk with her. If Madeleine died, his secrets would die with her. He would be free to rebuild, to lie about what happened, to continue his life without looking back. Robert forced his hands away from the oars and started the boat's engine. The mechanical sound drowned out Madeleine's increasingly faint cries as she struggled desperately to stay afloat. He sped away from the scene like a coward, without looking back even once. On the distant bank, the white horse had witnessed the entire cruelty with growing horror. The animal understood, on a primitive and instinctive level, that it had just witnessed the most terrible of crimes. A son deliberately abandoning his mother to die. Without hesitation, the horse galloped towards the water. The animal entered the river with fierce determination, its powerful hooves cutting through the current as it swam towards the spot where Madeleine had disappeared for the third time. Its instincts knew no greed or betrayal, only the urgent need to save an innocent life being destroyed by human malice. Meanwhile, Madeleine slowly sank, the wheelchair dragging her to the riverbed like a cruel anchor. Her strength quickly faded, and the icy water was numbing her senses. But even so, her last prayer was not for her own salvation. It was for the forgiveness of her son's lost soul, a son she had once loved more than her own life. The icy river water enveloped the white horse like a cold embrace, but it didn't hesitate for a second. Its powerful legs beat rhythmically against the strong current, creating small but determined waves as it headed for the spot where it had last seen the old woman disappear. Its dark eyes scanned the water's surface, searching for any sign of life. Feet below the surface, Madeleine fought against the unconsciousness that threatened to overcome her. The wheelchair had become tangled in her clothes, transforming into a deadly trap that inexorably dragged her to the river's rocky bottom. Her lungs burned from the lack of oxygen, and bright spots began to dance before her eyes. But then, through the haze of near death, she felt something different in the water around her. A strong, warm presence, powerful movements that created currents of hope in the liquid darkness that enveloped her. The white horse had found her. With a strength that seemed supernatural, the animal dove deeper, its instincts guiding it directly to where Madeleine was trapped. It managed to grasp part of her clothing with its teeth, but the wheelchair was too heavy and firmly tangled. For a terrible moment, it seemed that not even its determination would be enough, but the white horse was no ordinary animal. There was something special about its intelligence, a deep understanding of what it meant to protect the defenseless. With precise movements, it managed to position itself so that Madeleine could grasp its mane, allowing her to partially free herself from the deadly trap of the chair. The ascent to the surface was an epic battle against time and nature. The horse used all its strength to fight against the current that tried to drag them downstream, while Madeleine clung to it with the little strength she had left. Her wrinkled fingers intertwined in the animal's silky mane, creating a bond that transcended mere survival. When they finally surfaced, Madeleine could only take one desperate breath before starting to cough violently, expelling the water that had invaded her lungs. The white horse held her firmly, swimming with determination towards the nearest bank, which was opposite the spot where Robert had fled like a coward. The journey to the bank seemed to last an eternity. Madeleine drifted between consciousness and fainting, her mind trying to process the devastating betrayal she had suffered. The son she had loved unconditionally, whom she had raised with so much sacrifice and dedication, had tried to kill her deliberately. The emotional pain was almost as unbearable as the physical. The white horse felt the emotional weight of the woman it carried, as if it could perceive that she had been wounded far beyond the physical damage of the near drowning. Its movements became even more careful, almost tender, as if it were carrying something infinitely precious and fragile. When they finally reached the bank, the animal managed to position itself so that Madeleine could slide gently onto dry land. She fell onto the damp grass like a heavy burden, her blue eyes glazed and her breathing ragged. The cold had penetrated to her bones, and she shivered uncontrollably. The white horse did not abandon her. It lay down beside her, offering the warmth of its body while whinnying softly, as if calling for help. Its sounds echoed through the morning, carrying an urgency that any compassionate heart would immediately recognize. On the other side of the river, smoke curled from the chimney of a small, rustic cabin. It was the home of Silas, the retired fisherman who had lived alone for years, caring only for his faithful white horse. The man had just lit the fire to prepare his breakfast when he heard the desperate whinnies of his companion from across the water. Something was terribly wrong. In all the years they had lived together, the horse had never made sounds like those, urgent, almost human in their desperation. Silas dropped his mug and ran to the window, his eyes scanning the opposite bank until he found a scene that made his heart pound. Silas didn't lose a second. At 65, the retired fisherman maintained the agility of decades spent navigating those waters. He ran to his small canoe, tied to the bank, his eyes fixed on the impossible scene on the other side of the river, his white horse lying beside a human figure who appeared unconscious on the grass. The boat cut through the water with silent efficiency, propelled by experienced oars that knew every current and obstacle of that river. Silas had lost his wife, Eleanor, 5 years ago, and since then had lived a solitary existence, finding solace only in the faithful companionship of his horse. Seeing the animal in apparent despair awakened in him an urgency he hadn't felt in a long time. When he reached the opposite bank, the scene he found left him completely shocked. An elderly woman lay semi-conscious on the grass, her clothes drenched and her body trembling violently with hypothermia. Her white hair was plastered to her pale face, and she murmured incoherent words about someone who had left her in the cold water. "My God," Silas whispered, immediately kneeling beside the woman. "Ma'am, are you all right? What happened here?" The white horse approached its owner, pressing its muzzle against his shoulder as if reporting the terrible events it had witnessed. Silas could see in the animal's intelligent eyes a deep sadness and an urgency that transcended normal communication between man and horse. You saved her, didn't you, old friend?" Silas stroked the horse's damp mane, instantly understanding the heroism of what had happened. "She would have died if it weren't for you." Madeline slowly opened her eyes, her vision still blurred by the river water and the trauma. When she focused on the kind face of the unknown man leaning over her, her eyes filled with tears, not of relief, but of a devastating emotional pain that Silas couldn't fully comprehend. "My son," she whispered hoarsely, he left me to die." The words hit Silas like a punch to the gut. Son? What kind of son would leave an elderly mother to drown? He looked around, searching for signs of other people, but found only the emptiness of the tranquil morning and the worried whinnies of his horse. "Don't talk now, Mom," Silas said gently, taking off his own flannel shirt to wrap around her. "I need to get you home, warm you up, and tend to those wounds. We'll talk later." He carefully lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she was. Her physical fragility contrasted dramatically with the strength that still shone in her blue eyes, even through the pain. It was like carrying a porcelain doll that had been broken and then glued back together. Beautiful, but forever marked by the cracks. The white horse followed them to the canoe, adamantly refusing to leave the woman it had saved. Silas had to make 2 trips. First to safely take Madeline to his cabin, then to retrieve the horse, which swam partially to the boat to facilitate transport. In Silas's warm cabin, while Madeline recovered, wrapped in blankets by the fireplace, a shocking discovery changed everything. Her drenched purse had survived the fall, and inside it, Silas found identification documents that made his blood run cold. Madeline Sterling, mother of Robert Sterling, the region's wealthiest and most influential businessman. Silas knew Robert's reputation, a cold man in business, known for his relentless ambition and questionable methods. But this was inconceivable. How could a son try to kill his own mother? When he gently confronted Madeline with the discovery, she began to weep silently. They weren't tears of physical pain, but of a heart completely shattered by a betrayal that transcended any maternal nightmare. "Ah, he needed me to die," she whispered, her words breaking the cabin's silence like shattering glass. "I had documents, things that could harm him, but I kept them to protect him, not to destroy him." Silas felt a growing anger burn in his chest. The white horse, as if sensing the turbulent emotions in the room, approached Madeline and gently laid its head in her lap, a gesture of protection and comfort that deeply touched both humans present. While Madeline recovered in Silas's cozy cabin on the other side of town, Robert executed the second part of his devilish plan with the coolness of a seasoned actor. He arrived home with his face carefully composed into a mask of despair, his hair disheveled and his clothes slightly damp to lend credibility to his version of events. "Help! Someone help me!" he cried as he burst into the local police station, his voice laden with an anguish that seemed utterly genuine. My mother, she drowned. I tried to save her, but I couldn't." The police officers immediately mobilized, and within minutes, a rescue team was being organized. Robert perfectly played the role of the devastated son, his hands trembling as he recounted the distorted version of events to the sheriff. "We were out for a boat ride, just like we always did," he said, allowing genuine tears, born of guilt, not grief, to stream down his face. She was so happy, talking about old memories. Then, out of nowhere, she lost her balance trying to grab something that had fallen. The sheriff, a kind man who had known the family for years, placed a comforting hand on Robert's shoulder. I know how important your mother was to you, Robert. We'll find her, don't worry. But Robert knew they never would. The river was deep at that point, the current strong enough to sweep any evidence far away. In a few hours, he would officially be a tragic orphan, heir to an already substantial fortune, and free from the compromising documents that threatened to destroy his life. As search teams scoured the waters, Robert received an avalanche of condolences from the local elite. Business moguls, politicians, and prominent socialites came personally to express their sympathies for the terrible accident that had claimed the life of such a beloved lady in the community. Your mother was an angel," the mayor's wife said, embracing Robert with maternal tenderness. "Always so kind, always concerned for others. It's an irreparable loss for all of us." Every word of praise for Madeleine was like salt in an open wound. But Robert forced himself to accept the condolences with the dignity expected of a man in mourning. Internally, however, a small but persistent part of his conscience began to corrode him like acid. In Silas's cabin, Madeleine had regained enough strength to sit by the fireplace, the white horse loyally lying at her feet. Her clothes were dry and clean. Silas had carefully washed and dried everything while she slept. With the respectful care of someone who understood human dignity. "He must be saying it was an accident," she murmured, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Her voice was stronger now, but laden with a sadness that seemed to have permanently settled in her soul. "Robert has always been very clever. He'll have a convincing story." Silas sat in a nearby chair, his calloused hands holding a cup of tea he had prepared for her. "Madame Madeleine, forgive the question, but why would he do such a thing? What kind of documents could justify such cruelty?" Madeleine sighed deeply, stroking the head of the white horse that had become her silent protector. "Papers from the beginning of his career, contracts that weren't entirely honest. I kept them thinking they might be important someday, but I never imagined they would become a death sentence." "Do you have more copies? Anything that can prove what he did?" Silas asked, a glimmer of hope igniting in his eyes. Madeleine shook her head sadly. "Everything was in the envelope I took on the boat ride. I wanted to show them to him, explain why I had kept them. Ironically, I was ready to hand over exactly what he wanted to destroy. The weight of the cruel irony of the situation fell upon them both like a stone. Madeleine's maternal kindness had been used as a weapon against her by the very son she had tried to protect. Outside the cabin, night began to fall over the region. Somewhere nearby, search teams continued their useless operations, looking for a body they would never find at the indicated location and at the Sterling Manor. Robert received more condolences, each word of sympathy increasing both his sense of security and the poison of guilt that began to corrode his soul. The following days in Silas's cabin were marked by a slow and painful recovery, not just physical, but emotional. Madeleine spent hours gazing out the window overlooking the river, watching the waters that had almost become her tomb. The white horse rarely left her side, as if it understood that its presence was a balm for the wounded soul of the woman it had saved. "Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't have been better." Madeleine began one rainy afternoon, but stopped abruptly, as if the words were too heavy to be spoken. Silas, who was mending a fishing net by the fireplace, looked up with concern. In recent days, he had learned to read her silences, to interpret the moments when emotional pain became almost unbearable. "Don't say that," he replied softly, his hands pausing their manual work. "Your life has value, regardless of what your son did. The world became a better place with your presence, not worse." The words touched something deep in Madeleine's heart. How long had it been since someone affirmed her value as a person? Robert had always treated her like an accessory to his successful life, present for social events when convenient, hidden away when her fragility might harm his image as a powerful man. "Tell me about your wife," Madeleine asked, changing the subject to something less painful. "Silas, you said her name was Eleanor." The fisherman's face lit up with a mixture of joy and melancholy. Eleanor she was like a ray of sunshine. We laughed together every day, even when things got tough. She always wanted to have children, but... He paused, his voice choking. We never could. And now she's gone, and I keep thinking about how wonderful it would have been to have a family. Madeline reached out and gently touched his arm. You would have been a wonderful father, Silas. I can see it in the way you care for me, the way you care for your horse. Sometimes family isn't just blood. Sometimes it emerges in the most unexpected places. At that moment, the white horse approached and laid its head in Madeline's lap, as if agreeing with her words. The animal had become the link between two wounded hearts, two souls that found solace in each other after devastating losses. Meanwhile, in the town, Robert began to show signs of psychological deterioration. The guilt, which he thought he could bury along with the documents in the river, began to surface at unexpected moments. During important meetings, he would get distracted, hearing echoes of his mother's voice calling for help. At night, nightmares woke him in cold sweats. "Mr. Sterling, are you all right?" his secretary asked during a conference with investors. "You seem distracted." Robert forced a smile, nervously adjusting his tie. "I'm still dealing with the loss of my mother. It's hard to focus on business at times like this." The words sounded convincing to others, but he knew it was a lie. It wasn't grief he felt. It was corrosive guilt, constant fear that someone would discover the truth, and a growing paranoia that his mother might have somehow survived. Back at the cabin, Madeline had started helping Silas with small household tasks, finding purpose in the simple activities that gave structure to her days. Cooking together, caring for the horse, listening to fishermen's stories, all of it helped her slowly rebuild her sense of self-worth. "You know," she said one evening, as they watched the stars from the cabin's porch, "I spent so many years trying to be the perfect mother that I forgot to just be Madeleine. Now, forced to start over, maybe I can discover who I truly am." Silas smiled, seeing a growing strength in her eyes. "Eleanor used to say that sometimes we need to die to one life to be reborn into another. Maybe that's what's happening to you." The white horse, grazing near the porch, lifted its head as if listening to the conversation. There was something almost mystical in how the animal seemed to comprehend the human emotions around it, offering silent comfort when needed. The third week after the accident brought unexpected changes to the small rural community. On a sunny morning, Mrs. Betty Henderson, who owned the local general store, was organizing shelves when she spotted a familiar figure walking slowly down the dirt road leading to the more isolated part of the river. "Good heavens," she murmured to herself, adjusting her glasses to make sure of what she saw. "Isn't that... It can't be..." The woman, walking with the aid of an improvised cane, had snow-white hair and a frail build, but there was something unmistakably familiar about her silhouette. Mrs. Henderson had known Madeline Sterling for decades, buying groceries at her store, always gentle and polite to everyone. But Madeline was dead. She had tragically drowned during a boat ride with her son. The entire town had mourned her loss, and Robert was officially in mourning. How could it be her walking down the road as if nothing had happened? "Joe!" Mrs. Henderson called to her husband, who was mending a fence behind the store. "Come look at something strange." Joe approached, wiping his dirt-stained hands on his apron. When he looked in the direction his wife pointed, his eyes widened in surprise. "Betty, do you think it could be..." "I've known that woman for over 20 years," Mrs. Henderson said with conviction. "That's Madeline Sterling, or my name isn't Betty Henderson." The news spread through the community with the speed characteristic of small towns. Within hours, half the town knew that someone very much like Robert Sterling's deceased mother had been seen walking in the river area. Speculations were inevitable and disturbing. Maybe she lost her memory. suggested the local barber during a lively conversation in his barber shop. "I've heard of people surviving drownings and being confused for weeks." "Or maybe," said the blacksmith, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "it wasn't exactly an accident as we were told." This last remark created an uncomfortable silence in the room. No one wanted to openly accuse Robert Sterling of anything. He was too powerful, too influential to provoke without concrete evidence. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. At the Sterling manor, Robert felt the walls closing in around him. His personal attorney had called that morning with disturbing news about federal investigations getting closer to his past business dealings. Authorities were asking specific questions about contracts from the previous decade. They want documents to prove the legitimacy of some initial transactions, the attorney explained over the phone, his voice tense. "Robert, are you sure there's nothing compromising that could come to light?" Robert almost laughed at the cruel irony. The only truly compromising documents were at the bottom of the river with his mother, or at least that's what he hoped. "There's nothing to worry about," he lied. "All my business has always been legitimate." But then his secretary interrupted the call with news that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Sterling, I apologize for the interruption, but strange rumors are circulating in town. Some people say they've seen, well, someone who looks a lot like your mother." Robert dropped the phone. Impossible. He had seen Madeleine sink with his own eyes, had watched the wheelchair drag her into the river's depths. There was no human way she could have survived. "It must be some confusion," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Elderly people sometimes look alike. Grief can make us see things that aren't there." But internally, panic began to consume his sanity. If Madeleine were alive, if someone had found and cared for her, all his careful plans would turn to ash. She could tell the truth about what happened on the river. She could destroy the official version of events. At Silas's cabin, Madeleine had decided to take short walks to regain her strength. The fisherman always accompanied her, concerned for her safety, but respecting her need to regain independence. The white horse followed them at a respectful distance, like a silent guardian. "Silas," Madeleine said during one of these walks, "I need to face the truth about what Robert did. I can't live in hiding forever." "I understand," Silas replied, though his voice showed concern. "But we need to be careful. He's a powerful man, and if he really tried to kill you once—" Madeleine stopped walking and looked directly into the fisherman's eyes. "Then he'll try again. I know that. But I can't let fear stop me from seeking justice, not just for myself, but for all the people he might harm in the future." The white horse approached at that moment, as if sensing the growing determination in her voice, offering its silent but unwavering support. Robert's desperation reached dangerous proportions when he decided to act based on the rumors circulating in town. Using his influence and financial resources, he mobilized a discreet operation to investigate any sign of his mother's presence in the region. He hired private investigators under the pretext of finding possible imposters who might be taking advantage of his grief. "I want you to comb through every cabin, every isolated house within a 50-mile radius of the river," Robert instructed the chief detective, a grim-faced man known for his questionable methods. "If someone is impersonating my mother to extort money, I need to know immediately." The official version was convincing, a rich son protecting the memory of his deceased mother against cruel opportunists. But the reality was much more sinister. Robert knew that if Madeleine were truly alive, she represented an existential threat not only to his freedom, but to his very life. Silas sensed the signs of danger before he even saw them clearly. Strange men had been seen asking questions in the area, claiming to be looking for a confused elderly woman who might be lost. His instincts as an experienced fisherman, honed by decades of observing the subtleties of human nature, sensed the falsehood behind the apparent concern. "Madeleine," he said one morning, as she fed the white horse apples left over from breakfast, "I think we need to prepare for unwanted visitors." She looked up, immediately understanding the serious tone in his voice. "Robert is looking for me." "It seems so. There are men asking questions about an old woman who looks like you. They say they're worried about her safety." "But—" Silas shook his head. "Something doesn't sound right." The white horse seemed to feel the tension in the air. Its ears perked up, and it positioned itself protectively between Madeline and the trail leading to the cabin. It was as if the animal instinctively understood that new dangers were approaching its protector. That afternoon, the situation escalated when two men in suits appeared at Silas's cabin door. They identified themselves as private investigators working for Robert Sterling, and their voices were polite but carried an authority that brooked no questioning. "Sir?" the taller of the two asked, consulting a notepad. "Silas Miller," the fisherman replied cautiously, standing in the doorway to partially block the view into the cabin. "Mr. Miller, we're investigating reports of an elderly woman who may be confused or lost in the area. Her son, Mr. Robert Sterling, is extremely concerned. The lady may be suffering from memory problems related to recent trauma." Silas forced an expression of genuine confusion. "I haven't seen any lady around here. I live alone with my horse. I rarely have visitors." But the second investigator had noticed something. "Those clothes drying on the line," he pointed out. "They look like women's clothes." Silas's heart pounded, but he maintained his composure. "They belong to my sister. She visits occasionally and forgets things." Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Madeline was hidden in the back room, listening to every word of the conversation through the thin wooden walls. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from growing anger. Robert had managed to turn her very survival into something criminal, portraying her as a confused person who needed to be rescued for her own safety. The investigators didn't seem entirely convinced by Silas's explanations, but they didn't have enough evidence to force a search of the property. After a few tense minutes of additional questions, they left, but not before making it clear that they would return. "If the lady appears," the taller investigator said, handing a card to Silas, "please contact us immediately. It's for her own good." When the men finally moved away, Silas locked the door and hurried to the room where Madeline was hiding. He found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes shining with a determination he had never seen before. "They're coming back," she said, her voice firm despite the terrifying circumstances. "Robert won't give up. He knows that as long as I'm alive, his version of events can be challenged." "So what do we do?" Silas asked, sitting beside her. Madeline looked out the window, where the white horse grazed peacefully, oblivious to the human dangers approaching. "We stop hiding," she said with a courage that surprised even herself. "It's time to tell the truth to anyone who will listen." Outside, as if sensing the momentous decision that had been made, the white horse lifted its head and looked directly at the window, its dark eyes shining with a loyalty that transcended words. The morning of the confrontation dawned grey and heavy, as if the very sky anticipated the emotional storm that was about to erupt over the small community. Madeline had spent the night in prayer and reflection, mentally preparing herself for the most difficult moment of her life, publicly confronting the son who had tried to kill her. Silas organized everything with meticulous care. He contacted the local sheriff, the town's pastor, and several respected community figures, asking them to gather in the town square for an important clarification regarding recent events. He didn't reveal details, but his reputation as an honest man ensured the presence of the right people. Robert arrived at the square with all the pomp of his social position, impeccably dressed, surrounded by his attorney and some political allies. He still played the role of the grieving son with consummate mastery. When Robert saw the gathered crowd, he immediately assumed someone had organized a posthumous tribute to his mother. "It's truly touching to see how cherished my mother was by all of you," he began, his voice laced with false emotion, but he was interrupted by a growing murmur from the crowd. From the other side of the town square, three figures slowly approached. Silas walked beside an elderly woman leaning on a cane, and behind them, astonishing everyone present, came a white horse. Following the two like a loyal guardian, the silence that fell over the square was deafening. People who had known Madeleine for decades gasped, barely able to believe their own eyes. The woman, who was supposed to be dead, tragically drowned in the river, walked towards the center of the square with a dignity that transcended her physical fragility. Robert felt his legs turn to jelly. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him pale as a ghost. For one terrible moment, he thought he was hallucinating, that guilt had finally shattered his sanity. But then his mother's blue eyes fixed on his, and he knew this was terribly real. "My God," whispered the pastor, making the sign of the cross. "It's really Madeleine." "Impossible," murmured the sheriff, looking from Robert to the approaching woman. "How can she be alive?" Madeleine stopped in the center of the square, leaning on her cane, but with an upright posture that radiated courage. The white horse positioned itself beside her, as if it knew this was the most important moment of her life. Silas remained close, ready to support her if needed. "My dear community," Madeleine began, her clear voice echoing across the silent square, "I know my presence here today is shocking. You were led to believe that I died, drowned in a tragic accident." Robert tried to approach, his mind desperately searching for a way to control the situation. "Mom, thank God you're alive. Where have you been? We searched everywhere." But Madeleine raised her hand, stopping him from coming closer. "Stop, Robert. There are no more lies between us." The authority in her voice made her son recoil involuntarily. Everyone present realized that something very serious was happening. This was not a happy reunion between a mother and son who had survived a tragedy. There was no accident," Madeleine said, each word falling like a stone in the absolute silence of the square. "My own son tried to kill me, deliberately pushing me into the deep river water, knowing my paralyzed legs would not allow me to swim." The impact of her words was like an emotional earthquake. People gasped in shock, others covered their mouths in horror, and the growing murmur transformed into a cacophony of incredulous voices. This is insane," Robert protested, his voice rising an octave. "She's confused. The trauma of the near drowning has affected her mind." But Madeleine continued, relentless. "He wanted me to die because I kept documents that proved irregularities in his early business dealings, documents that I had preserved, thinking I was protecting my son, but which he saw as a threat to his freedom." The sheriff approached, his expression grave. "Madame Madeleine, these are very serious accusations. Are you sure of what you're saying?" "Absolutely," she replied, looking directly at Robert. "And if it weren't for this heroic horse, who dove into the river to save me when my own son abandoned me to die, I would not be here today to tell the truth." The white horse, as if understanding it was being mentioned, stepped forward and fixed its dark eyes on Robert. It was as if the animal was serving as a silent witness to the cruelty it had witnessed. Robert's collapse was as sudden as it was devastating. Faced with his mother's public accusation and the horrified stares of an entire community, something inside him finally broke. The mask of the devoted son he had worn for weeks finally fell, revealing the desperate and cruel man behind the respectable facade. "You don't understand," he yelled, completely losing his composure. "I was going to lose everything. My company, my reputation, my freedom. Those damn documents you kept like a sentimental fool were going to destroy my life." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert had just publicly confessed his guilt before dozens of witnesses. The sheriff immediately signaled to his deputies to approach, while Robert's attorney desperately tried to control him. "Robert, shut up. Don't say another word," the attorney whispered urgently. But it was too late. Madeleine observed her son's collapse with a mixture of deep sadness and relief. There was no satisfaction in her victory, only the pain of a mother seeing her worst fears confirmed about what her son had become. "You had a choice, Robert," she said softly, her voice laden with a wisdom that only profound suffering can bring. "You could have come to me, explained your problems, asked for help. I would have destroyed those documents if I knew they were threatening you, but you chose violence instead of love." The crowd began to stir as the reality of the situation fully sank in. Robert Sterling, the region's most respected businessman, had tried to kill his own mother for money. The implications were shocking, not only because of the cruelty of the act, but because of what it revealed about the character of the man many had trusted. "Arrest him," the sheriff ordered, his voice heavy with disgust. "Robert Sterling, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Madeleine Sterling." When the handcuffs touched his wrists, Robert looked at his mother one last time. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the boy he had been, frightened, lost, regretful. But it was too late for redemption. Some choices cannot be undone, some acts cannot be forgiven. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered as he was led away. And for the first time in weeks, his tears were genuine. Madeleine did not respond. There were no words for the magnitude of the betrayal she had suffered. Instead, she leaned more firmly on her cane and allowed Silas to help her move away from the still murmuring, shocked crowd. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the small community. The national media picked up the case, transforming it into a symbol of the moral corruption that can result from the unrestrained pursuit of wealth and power. Robert lost not only his freedom, but also his fortune, which was confiscated by authorities as part of the investigations into his fraudulent business dealings. The federal investigations he so feared intensified after his arrest. Without the documents Madeleine had kept, and which were now at the bottom of the river, investigators had to build their case in other ways. But the attempted murder had opened so many doors that other evidence began to emerge from unexpected sources. Former employees who had been intimidated into silence found the courage to speak. Competitors who had been harmed by unethical practices came forward with their own evidence. The empire Robert had built on lies and manipulation collapsed like a house of cards. Throughout this period, Madeleine remained at Silas's cabin, refusing all offers of interviews and maintaining a dignified silence about the more intimate details of her experience. She had told her truth when necessary. Now it was time to focus on healing. The white horse never left her alone during these difficult days. The animal seemed to understand that, although justice had been served, its protectee's emotional pain was still deep and real. Its constant presence offered a solace that words could not provide. One afternoon, as she watched the sunset over the river that had almost become her tomb, Madeleine finally managed to cry all the tears she had held back. They were not just tears of pain, but also of relief, of freedom, and strangely, of gratitude for having discovered that good people still existed in the world. People like Silas, who helped strangers without expecting anything in return. 6 months after the confrontation in the square, life by the river had found a new rhythm, softer and more meaningful than anything Madeleine could have imagined in her lonely days at the manor. Silas's cabin, which once housed only a solitary man and his melancholic memories, now vibrated with the warm energy of a family chosen by heart, not by blood. The morning always began the same way. Madeleine prepared coffee while Silas checked his fishing nets and gear. The white horse grazed peacefully near the porch, but always with a watchful eye on the lady he had saved from the treacherous waters. It had become more than a pet. It was the silent guardian angel protecting the peace won at such a cost. "You know," Madeleine said that special morning, pouring fresh coffee into a porcelain cup she herself had brought from town when she officially decided to move into the cabin, "I never thought it would be possible to be so happy at 70. Silas smiled, accepting the cup with hands that no longer trembled with loneliness. Her presence had healed wounds in his soul that he didn't even know existed. Eleanor used to say that life gives us second chances when we least expect them. I think she was right. Madeleine had transformed completely in recent months. The fragility that characterized her during her years in the wheelchair gave way to a serene strength that radiated from within. She had learned to walk again, not just physically, but emotionally. Every step she took along the path leading to the river was a declaration of independence and rebirth. The local community had embraced her presence with a warmth that deeply touched her. Mrs. Henderson at the general store always saved the best produce for her. The pastor visited her regularly for conversations that transcended religious matters, and the local children had adopted the white horse as a kind of living legend, the four-legged hero who had saved the gentle lady from the dark waters. Ms. Madeleine, a 6-year-old girl, had asked the week before, "Is it true your horse is magic?" "He's not magic, dear," Madeleine had replied, stroking the animal's silky mane. "He's something much more special. He's a pure heart that acts without thought of reward." Robert had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, in addition to facing multiple charges for corporate fraud. Madeleine had not attended the trial. She told the sheriff that her presence would not change the justice of the verdict, and that she preferred to use her energy building something new instead of reliving past horrors. She had received a letter from him from prison, asking for forgiveness. The letter remained unopened in a dresser drawer. Perhaps one day she would find the strength to read it, but for now, she was focused on living, not on forgiving. The garden she and Silas planted together was flourishing magnificently. Roses, sunflowers, and daisies created a colorful carpet that stretched from the porch almost to the river's edge. It was symbolically perfect, beauty growing exactly where evil had tried to triumph. "Silas," Madeleine said, placing her hand over his as they watched the golden sunset reflect on the calm waters, "do you believe people can truly start over after 70? "I believe you are living proof of it," he replied, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You not only survived the cruelest betrayal anyone can suffer, you transformed that experience into wisdom and strength." The white horse approached at that moment, as it always did when it sensed that important conversations were taking place. It laid its head in Madeleine's lap, and she felt again that special connection they had developed since the rescue, a communication that transcended words. "Thank you," she whispered to the animal, knowing it would understand. "For saving me, for protecting me, for showing me that pure goodness still exists in this world." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Madeleine made a discovery that surprised her. She realized she no longer felt anger towards Robert. She had gone through all the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally arrived at acceptance. Not acceptance of what he did, but acceptance that she could not change the past, only choose how to live the future. Her tears that night were not of pain, but of profound gratitude. Gratitude for having survived, for having found Silas, for having discovered that true wealth lies not in money or status, but in the ability to love and be loved unconditionally. The man who had tried to destroy her for greed now faced his demons in a cold cell. The woman he had tried to eliminate flourished under the stars, surrounded by genuine love and protected by a four-legged angel who had proven that loyalty knows no species. The river continued its eternal course, carrying away old waters and always bringing new possibilities. And Madeleine smiled, knowing that her own life had followed the same pattern. What almost destroyed her ended up renewing her completely.